Welcome to Pandooradom. I am your host, Miles Gray, my pseudonym. I'm otherwise known as Ben Qan'i. I am talking to you right now from a major city in central Israel. I live here, and I have lived here for many, many, many years. I am reporting to you now as a person, as a poet, as an epicist, as a writer, an author, a musician, a father, a husband, as a man, about the things that we have gone through and the things that we have found passage through in these recent of days. Now, this is nothing new. These are things that we have had to make part of our lives, whether we liked it or not, for decades, for centuries, for millennia. So what is happening now is nothing new, but it is the latest iteration of a very old, ongoing catastrophe. I have to admit that I am frazzled, and yet I know exactly where I am and what I am doing. There is great trauma, and yet people are quite resilient on the face of it, at least. You learn quite a bit about trauma and what it really is when you live through wars. I come to you from a place now, at the age that I am, of having witnessed, having seen firsthand what it is like to be a young man in the West, one who is greatly influenced and probably impaired by ideological possession. Many of my family were Marxists or neo-Marxists. I grew up with that as a purported value among some of my family, my dad's side. My mother's side, maybe a little bit, but they were mostly artists and therapists. It is a Jewish family, one that is in some ways quite assimilated, and yet in other ways is still quite traditionally Jewish in culture and in spirit, and even in observation to some degree. Is not that I grew up without observation of holidays and of what it means to be Jewish, and even in learning Hebrew, which I was exposed to from the earliest of ages. So, though in a certain way English is my native tongue, uh, Hebrew is a heritage tongue or heritage language, which I grew up with and has been a very huge part of my life, along with English and a number of other languages, not merely because I know them and use them, but because I write in them and I publish books in them. I publish books in Hebrew and in English and write also poems in Arabic, Maltese, Portuguese, Italian, Danish, did I say Japanese, Chinese, etc. And it's not that I am a complete expert in all these languages, but I have been employed wherein I needed to have some knowledge of all of these different languages, their syntax and usage. But I've also published in them, as I said. Why do I bring this up? All the other languages, it kind of shows perhaps that I have a deeper, it's a clue to a deeper issue, which is that I, as a person, am a kind of anthropologist in my very character. I have lived in many places abroad. I've traveled in over 60 countries, which compared to people who have been to most of the world's countries is not so many. And yet, the way that I traveled is quite distinct. I traveled by train, by car, hitchhiking, bus, walking, and all other manner of travel possibilities. I've traveled also by bicycle. Now, it's not a regular bicycle. It was a penny farthing, a scaled down version of a penny farthing. And most notably, I traveled by unicycle. Now, I don't mean I just rode a few miles. I rode thousands upon thousands of kilometers by unicycle alone through the jungles of Southeast Asia, the palm plantations, and many other climes. Why did I do that? Well, as a Jew, I found it important to not only observe in traditional ways, to find something meaningful that was unique to me as well, without going to some sort of abominatory heathenness, which was to ride a unicycle. Because as I looked down upon the road, I always saw that one wheel below me, and that always reminded me upon every ride and throughout the ride, the Shema. What is the Shema? In Judaism, the most central thing that one says, one could argue, is the Shema, where you declare, among other things, the oneness of God. And that is one of the main points of Jewish belief, and one also that many other religions have received as a prime value from Judaism historically. Now, seeing that one wheel of my unicycle reminded me of the Shema, and what does it say in the Shema? That God is one. So I always was reminded God is one upon looking down at my unicycle. Now, when I say God, I don't mean Sky Daddy, because these are the sorts of images that come to mind. Flying spaghetti monster, some deity that is imaginable and embodied. No. Judaism teaches that God is incorporeal. He has no body. It has no body. You can't really say what God is. You can only say what God isn't. And God is a very cosmic thing, if I can be permitted to say thing, because what other word could possibly approximate what this thing is? Even saying deity or being is incorrect. It's it introduces incorrect feelings and connotations that go against what I just said, which is that you can say what God isn't, but not what he is. Because if you already say God is a deity or God is a being, you start to get into territory where you're saying what God is. And God is not a being in the sense that a human being generally understands that. Why do I bring talk of God and theology into this matter? Well, because the war that we are currently going through is intimately connected to conceptions of God. The two religions that are at war, or should I even say three, are the Abrahamic ones. The original, which is Judaism. Then you have the daughter religion, which came along about 2,000 years ago, well after Judaism began, Christianity. And then you have the youngest of the three major Abrahamic religions, though not the youngest of all that there are, Islam. Now, Christianity and Islam owe much, very, very much, in their theology, their conception of God, and many other tenets to Judaism, that they sprung therefrom in many, many regards. Now, that's not all that they are. They contain elements from other things and other places as well in mixed. Islam in particular is quite syncretic. That is to say that it mixed together elements of Judaism, pre-Islamic pagan, or Saudi, not, not Saudi, it wasn't Saudi yet, Arabian peninsular paganism, and certain forms of Christianity that were sort of in circulation in the Arab Peninsula of that era, about, well, quite a bit, several centuries less than 2,000 years ago. More than several, actually, but anyway, we'll get to that perhaps another time. The reason I bring this up once again, though, is because these three religions are, in a way, in a constant tug of war. And the rope is, as you might imagine, Israel. You could say in a more symbolic way, Jerusalem. Israel being the rope is a very strange notion because Jewry is a very small populace, is composed of a very small number of adherents, or of not even adherents really. It's, Judaism is very different, in fact, from Christianity and Islam because we are not merely adherents. We are not merely devotees. We are, even if we are, which we may not be, it's also an ethnicity. It is a peoplehood. And it is a way of life. Now, Islam and Christianity are also ways of life, religions, but they're not ethnicities. And they're not, they don't comprise a peoplehood in the same way that it is. And when I say peoplehood, what I mean is at peoplehood in an anthropological sense. So when you say, for example, the Jewish people, the Pira'a people, that's a people. There's no such thing as the Islamic people or the Christian people. There are many different peoples who adhere to Islam or to Christianity or to some variant of those religions. Now, this is no judgment upon these religions or their validity. It's just a fact on the scale of anthropology. So, Judaism, albeit much smaller in terms of the number of people who can be called Jews compared to Christianity and Islam, uh, it, it is a still a highly an inordinately influential force. Now, not in the sense that anti-Semites mean it, because that is a common claim among anti-Semites, of course, that Israel or Judaism or the Jews somehow control everything or large amounts of things. Now, it is so, of course, though, that Jews have been able to find a way to survive and to thrive in a world that is highly hostile to them, to us. That much is true. But the idea that it's anything more than that is false, patently. because we are among the world's most persecuted people. Again, people in an anthropological sense. And yet, we are accused of being the masterminds, often of our own destruction, it is claimed. Things that are wildly absurd in a room of rational minds. But where do you find these rooms of rational minds? Perhaps they barely exist. Now, you have to understand, I look aside because I'm checking my phone, guilty as charged. Why? I'm not looking for the latest dopamine rush, serotonin, and what else I might find. The reason I'm not looking to see what notifications I got on whatever, uh, you know, social media site or WhatsApp message. Like, ooh, who's gotten back to me? What have they said about me? What have they said to me? Are they congratulating me on my recent poem? I'm quite partial to that sort of thing. That's my thing. Like I do get excited about that kind of rush that I see, oh, well, I got like a kind of a claim of some kind for something I've recently written. And for other people, it might be that, or it might be many other things. It could be that they posted a great picture of a vacation and then 100 people like it, 1,000 people like it, 10,000 people like it. What does that really mean? That's a whole other question. But it makes that person feel good for the moment. Ooh, look who I am and how great I feel. And but what I'm saying is it's not that. Why am I looking at my phone to tell you, finally, is because we are at war. And for the last month, it has been non-stop, almost non-stop missile attacks from Iran, from or I should say, how do you say mishtal in English? The regime, the Iranian regime. Now, it's not the people, what I would call the Persians. It is the Iranian regime. We're talking about, well, it was the various ayatollahs, yes. It was Ali Khamenei. It is his son, Mujtaba, who seems possibly to be in Qom in some sort of not a great state, perhaps. And it is Larijani, it is the IRGC, but it is not the people themselves, the Persians, as I call them. Now, there are some who, of course, are quite loyal to the regime, but there are many others who are not. And I suspect even the ones that are, on the face of it, loyal are not truly loyal, and that given the chance, they would. Hmm, I am missing this word in English. Defect. Not missing, that's not the right word in English either. The word escapes me. Yes. Okay. So, knowing all these different languages, the issue is that the different vocabulary, the different lexical systems come into my mind at once, and I have the perfect Hebrew word, I have the perfect Maltese word, but not the right English word or phrase, and yet it takes a minute for me to find the right translation. So this happens. Now, this this is probably familiar to any polyglot. Although I would say some seem to have a much quicker recall. See, I'm not a magician in terms of my recall. I'm not a showman in that way that I can just pull it out of my hat without any kind of pause. For me, it's much more measured, and there are deep processes going in here that have to run their course before I can even say a word and make produce a sound that should come out of my mouth. Things are thought and hopefully thought out before they come out of this mouth. But I'm trying to keep up to speed as much as I possibly can. But I'm also exhausted, and that plays a role. It is nonstop, as I said, these missile attacks. It has been impossible. Now, for years and years and years, how far do we want to go back? We can go back to all of Jewish history, millennia, and what the Jews have experienced at the hands of our self-declared, and that is key, enemies. We can talk about the Ottoman Empire. We can talk about the British Mandate. Then we have 1948. Then we have 1967. We have all the years in between. We have decades of suicide bombings, of terrorist attacks on an individual or the basis of small groups, relatively small. Then we get to the over 40,000 rockets sent to us since about 2001 by Hamas. Then we have the pulling out of Gaza, 2005 and 6, depending how you look at it, of Israel from Gaza, uprooting the Jews who lived there and having them come into Israel proper. And even bones of Jews were removed so that they would not be tampered with after the full exit. That shouldn't be a concern, but it is. Something like that. See, the thing is something like that would never happen in Israel. The analog, it would never happen. It would never happen. There are cultural differences, there are anthropological differences, and there's so much propaganda and disinformation and misinformation in the world at large that it is almost impossible to understand these nuanced subtleties from the outside. And especially because many of you are not willing to listen. And I don't mean to be accusatory. I don't know who's listening to this, if anybody even is. But for those of you who are, there may be some of you who have no idea what I'm talking about, or you do hear some of what I'm saying, and you say, that's absolutely not what I've heard. This is propaganda. This is hasbara. I'm telling you as a pretty reasonable and sober person, as eccentric as I may be, that much of, perhaps most of what you heard is wrong. And there are reasons why that is so. It's not just what we would call stam. There is a rhyme and reason to why people lie about the Jews and Israel. And at root, it is the age-old explanation, which is anti-Semitism in its various forms, and it's a most advanced form that we're dealing with now. So to get back to what I was talking about, we are now in a situation where I'm looking at my phone every few minutes, not because I'm looking for that rush, but because I'm looking for any alerts I may have missed about incoming missile attacks from the Iranian regime. We get to October 7th of 2023, a most brutal, horrific day, the worst mass murder of Jews since the Holocaust. I remember that day, and I was here in Israel, and we witnessed these things firsthand. You cannot imagine such atrocities. You cannot. Being a writer who is absolutely obsessed with the idea of putting into words deep imagery, that's one of my main things. I've struggled with this to be able to put into words, what transpired, not just during October 7th, but in anything I've experienced or want to tell about, to really bring it to life in what is before one's eyes. It's not just that, of course, it's also the other senses, smell, touch, what is heard, what is deeply experienced in a way that is emergent and somehow beyond perhaps the sum of all the senses together, and maybe the sixth sense and the seventh, eighth, ninth, tenth, and on senses that were purported by some to have. Well, it's very difficult, verging on impossible. And yet, some great writers, some great storytellers, and I don't mean people who spin yarns, I mean people who are really just good at telling what actually happened, good narrators of actual events, are able to put into your mind an image that will fell that tree of ignorance that is rooted deeply in your brain. To fell that tree of ignorance that is deeply rooted in the bog of your brain. Now, I won't tell you about October 7th right now. That is something that you can research. That is something that I will talk about hopefully in future videos, provided I don't get blown up today or on some other day during this war. Believe I've spoken about it though in previous videos to some degree, and if not me, then there are many others. And I'm writing a book about it too, so in any case, my manuscript is available. There's video. There is testimony. There is incontrovertible evidence, well documented, despite so many lies, easily disprovable ones to the contrary, that you see online and everywhere, all around. It's akin to Holocaust denial. It's October 7th denial. People were brutally deleted, brutally raped in ways that you cannot conceive of. It wasn't just. It wasn't stam. It was above and beyond the way that these atrocities were carried out. It was done with glee. Glee, if you can imagine such a thing. It wasn't mere barbarity. It was barbarity with ecstatic, ideologically possessed, religiously euphoric glee. Glee, which is among the most jarring aspects of that day of atrocities, because everything else is almost somehow conceivable, but the glee is inconceivable and makes the whole thing not make any sense. Because if you're a student of history, especially of Jewish history, one is no stranger to pogroms. But to see it done with such glee, it makes it so that it is ununderstandable beyond what you can possibly say about your average pogrom against the Jews or some other disadvantaged people. Now, yes, you say, oh yes, the Jews disadvantaged, you say, and you say that as an Israeli. What about the other side? Well, see, this is the whole issue now. We'll get into that another time. So then we get to 2024. the whole fallout of 2023 has already been underway for some time. First, we have a little bit of sympathy for Israelis and Jews. There was a little bit. It was significant. But it quickly, by October 8th, starting from then, it was turning into direct, abject anti-Semitism of a degree which many Jews I don't think expected to ever see in their own lifetimes. Lies, propaganda, agitprop, things that are unimaginable, the madness of the claims, and yet they were believed wholesale and continue to be. And they were even picked up by legacy media, by the UN, by Amnesty International, by B'Tselem, and so forth. You know, average updated blood libels about Israel and its policy and praxis. Doesn't mean, of course, that Israel is innocent in every way. No country is. And yet, Israel is far more blameless than countries which routinely demonize Israel, who have horrific human rights records, and yet nothing is said, or very little is said. And certainly there are no Western protests going on in the streets of major cities protesting those countries for their certain human rights abuses, or very little attention is paid in any case. But even when the accusations are based on lies and are things that didn't really happen, you have anti-Israel agitation, protests, and so forth going on every day at all hours. It is an obsession. And I believe it makes sense somehow that for so much of the West, Israel is a central place. It is a nexus of all things that seem to matter. It doesn't even mean that a person has to be a practicing Christian or Muslim or Jew or Baha'i, etc. But somehow, because of cultural orientation, if you're part of the West in some way, and even beyond the West, Israel still carries this central position in the psyche. And so whether you hate the Jews and Israel or you love them, or it's some mixture of the two, where you hate the Jews and love Israel, or you love the Jews and hate Israel, or whatever, or did I mix whatever you get the idea. It's still a huge part of people's psyche. It becomes a mantra, it becomes a code, it becomes something that people live by. People who have very little actual connection, people who have basically no practical skin in the game, even if they feel like they have some spiritual connection or say about this place. It's not just a physical place, of course. So that's the thing. So we're in 2024. Gradually, some of that beginning sympathy for Israel has already given way to cascades, waterfalls of renewed anti-Semitism. I mean, I grew up with anti-Semitism, and yet it was somehow popularly seen as demeaning and pathetic. There was at least an attempt made by authorities to punish or to somehow admonish the people responsible. Ah, okay. You put a swastika in my desk. Say sorry. Write him a letter of apology. I mean, the kid who chased me around with a broken glass bottle for being a Jew in Providence, Rhode Island when I was a kid. I don't know. I don't think anything, I don't know if I even told anybody, but I imagine he would have been told not to do that again. I mean, what does that really do? And yet, I don't know how much education does. This is the problem. I mean, how many initiatives were, how much money was spent, how many initiatives were initiated uh, in all those years, especially after the Holocaust across the West and especially in places like America. I mean, perhaps you had a Holocaust survivor come to your school and talk to you in the assembly room as a school. Happened with a lot of us back in the 80s and 90s, the millennials. We had those Holocaust survivors who came to our school and talked to us as a school more than once, I'm sure. I remember reading Night by Eli Wiesel and so many that we were, made to read in school and rightly. And yet I've also read so much on my own, so much. Holocaust poetry, testimonials. I've watched so many testimonials. I have spent literally years and years of my life studying this subject and how it connects to other subjects, but especially on the level of literature. I think most of the world is probably most familiar with Anne Frank or Anna Frank and her diary, or some people like to say her book, which is perhaps a little bit more fitting for the nobility of what she did. It wasn't a mere diary, is what I mean. It was a book. But it goes so much deeper than that. So much deeper than that. And that's what we have to try to remember and understand. You have people who had poems written in the pocket of their camp uniform, dead in death marches on the side of the path. You have great poems in Yiddish, in Hebrew, written in camps, stuffed into glass bottles and corked, somehow stopped up and buried under trees to be retrieved, hopefully, after the war. That's World War II. Things that are difficult to understand, and yet we have not only record of such things happening, we have the very texts, the very poems, the books that they comprised. Truly grateful that they survived. And we have that going on even today. So many books, so much has been produced after October 7th as well, especially in Hebrew, which is really important. My own work among them. Now, all through 2024, we're going through this. And then we have what I would call these sort of demonstrative parade-like showings off by Iran of its ballistic missile arsenal, among other types of missiles. So there were two, I believe, to my memory, in 2024 that were sent, two barrages. They didn't do much. I mean, they were mostly shot down. Uh, and there was some minor hitting, we'll say, minor petting. It was more demonstratory, I think, than anything else. Or that's at least how it was perceived here. It was almost like an occasion to see fireworks. It was that absurd. But it was scary at the same time. Nobody knew quite what to expect on those eves. I remember. I remember that. Remember very, very well those nights, staying up until they came to see them in the sky. But knowing what I know now, it's inconceivable that I was standing on the balcony watching this like they were fireworks. I mean, there are people who still do that even now, but anyway, so you had that. Then we get to 2025. The world is completely on fire with renewed anti-Semitism, which seems to have a lot to do not with Israel's supposed responses, and they really are supposed. They're not understood and they're heavily lied about. People really don't know what Israel does or has done. They don't. They have no idea. And it's a willful ignorance. Again, Israel's not perfect, but what we do is basically reasonable and rational. And we do a hell of a lot, way more even than perhaps we should do in trying to minimize casualties and to minimize suffering. But unfortunately, the self-declared enemies with which we are dealing that hate us on the basis of our being Jewish, don't let anybody tell you otherwise, and they themselves say it and have written it officially. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what we do because, as we've seen throughout Jewish history, no matter how noble the Jewry tries to be, we are constantly inverted upon. That is to say that what our self-declared enemies do, we are accused of in the end, or some other sort of canard becomes gospel. It's very difficult too because it's highly minimized that, you bring up how much anti-Semitic incidents, especially in the West, have doubled, have tripled, quadrupled, quintupled in the last few years. Huge numbers of hundreds of percentages going up in incidences of anti-Semitic uh, occurrences. And yet you have people who say, well, I mean, yeah, maybe that is a problem, but how does that really compare to what we're dealing with in America with with immigration issues, with ICE? How does it compare to so many other concerns? And it is true that there are many concerns in the world that are valid concerns. And yet, there can't even be a moment taken to really acknowledge that there is an anti-Semitism problem that is different in character to any other form of hatred. That has to be understood and has to be acknowledged. And if you don't, you're in a position such as Iran is in now, and you put yourself in that position as Iran has. I should say the regime has. So now we get to 2025, as I said, and we have the 12-day war. This was another level because we had experienced, of course, for decades, rockets from Hamas. We had experienced terrorist attacks, endless lies and disinformation about Israel. You kind of get used to it. You get used to it. It almost seemed like just a part of daily life. Or no, it did. It did seem like a part of daily life, running to shelters and so forth when there were Hamas rockets coming. But it got to be so routine and, just It was daily life. But the damage that those rockets could inflict, it was nothing compared to what the current ballistic missiles that we're dealing with. Uh, and it's kind of a scale. I mean, the way it seems to me is that Hamas rockets were, pretty dinky pieces of equipment, but they could still be fatal. So you should at least be, in a safe room or some sort of what we call a miklat, which is a bomb shelter, or a mamad, which is a safe room. It's a fortified room in apartment buildings that, many apartments have. Not all though, unfortunately. Uh, and you were, pretty assured to be okay in the face of such things. And then you have rockets. These are rockets primarily from Hezbollah in Lebanon. And, these are like they're a step up. These are very also quite deadly, but they're rockets, so it's a little different. But a lot are sent often in large salvos, so it is that kind of makes up for their smaller size and lesser damage inflicted, at least on the face of it. But there are ways in which it can be worse depending on the hit and other factors. Also, the how close it is, because the Lebanon is it borders the north of Israel, and many of the attacked places are in the north. So it's a very small sort of arc from being shot from Lebanon and then landing in northern Israel. So that also helps with things like precision of attack and that sort of thing. But then you get up to the Houthi missiles. I mean, these are big missiles, but they are, it's usually one or two sent at a time, and it's not, they very rarely do much, and they're mostly shot out of the sky. Now, that is also true, of course, of much of the other ordnance being shot at us. The grand majority is shot out of the sky, but a certain amount does get through, sadly. And then we get to Iran. So the Iranian regime's missiles, and I'm not talking about drones and all that. That also plays a role in the war and wars. But it's the missiles specifically, the ballistic missiles, and of course the illegal cluster warhead missiles, which are so common now in the last few weeks, being lobbed at us. Now, it is true that Israel has used also cluster weaponry in the past in Lebanon, but it was against military targets. Um, Not to say that that justifies it exactly. I mean, you can get into arguments of that nature, but these cluster missiles being sent from the Iranian regime are not meant for military targets, or I'm sure they would not be displeased if they hit one, but they're especially being lobbed at civilians and civilian uh, not sorry, architecture is not the word, infrastructure, architecture too. Uh, uh, okay, sorry. Okay, so yeah, I just got a notification on the phone. You don't know what it's gonna be because okay, so it's basically another part of Israel where we were staying before, which also got a lot of missiles as well, but it was a little bit well, it's like, you choose one part for another. Like we were in the south where they're getting a lot of missiles right now too. So we were there trying to get away from some of the missilery here in the center of Israel, but then we got so much there that we came back here, but we're still getting a lot and it's increasing. So I mean, it's like, where are you gonna go? Now, yeah. So anyway, I don't have much more time here to make this video, but just wanted to give you a sense of that. We get to 2026 after the horrifying 12-day war. I mean, this was I mean, I don't this is the thing. I mean, obviously there are people suffering all over the world dealing with wars, but people seem to know very little or to have very little concept of Jewish or Israeli suffering in time of war, especially the 12-Day War. I mean, this is something that is so underreported outside of Israel and Jewish newspapers. It's really upsetting because many others get, some level of discussion, and so little is said or acknowledged about the Israeli experience of these wars uh, and the trauma involved. Because Israelis have to live under this constantly, some iteration of this, which is based on a deep, burning historical hatred of our people, which is irrational. So it's not something that just happens once in a while. This is something that happened this century, or this is something that has been going on for thousands of years, and it's just with no end in sight. Again, just an iteration of a very old thing, the latest iteration of a very old phenomenon. That's why it's so different in a way. And that difference is not so widely acknowledged, and you should. You should make peace with yourself about that. I know that I have, and I have tried to do. We get to 2026, our current year, at the time of the making of this video, and we come to what in English is called Operation Epic Fury under Trump and his administration. And paired with that, we have the Israeli operation, which is called Mivtza She'agat Ha'ari, or Ha'ari. Okay, that means you can try. It's translated in English often as Operation. Excuse me. Uh, operate. What is it called? Sorry, Operation Roaring Lion, I believe. But it's more properly translated, I would say, as Operation Lion's Roar. But that's a linguistic question. So this, of course, mm, the 12-Day War was traumatic as it was. I mean, you thought you were going to die at any moment. It was very insane. But then we get to this, which is already a 30-day war beyond and beyond. I mean, we're now at a point that it eclipses the 12-day war. I mean, you thought you couldn't go beyond that, and you can. And it's only seemingly, as of tonight, is only accelerating. So it is very scary. I continue to write about it, and I thought I would make this short video to tell you what we're experiencing. I mean, before I go, I just want to say that it is the booms. That is the part that is truly beyond, because you're living your daily life. I mean, this is something that I'd like to talk about in a later video, is how it's a dual reality, a dual life and yet it is one life, but you have these two parts of it. On the one hand, you're constantly running to bomb shelters no matter what you're doing or where you are. You're constantly running to bomb shelters. You're constantly dropping everything that you're doing, running to that bomb shelter, closing that hermetic door, hearing those horrendous blasting booms that shake you, um, dealing with the ongoing pressure and certainty that those sirens could go off at any moment, or those alerts prior to the sirens, depending on how much warning you get on a particular attack. And you're living like that for weeks and weeks on end, and possibly it could be more than that. I mean, we're now in a month of this. But again, this is just the latest iteration. I mean, because we were living in the same manner during all of those attacks from the Hamas rockets, but it was just a different level of fear. Because those were, like I said, kind of dinky rockets. I mean, they were scary, but you could afford to see it with a lot of sort of dismissive humor. And yet now, yeah, there's a lot of dismissive humor among Israelis even now, with Iranian missiles, but which are much more deadly, uh, and much more catastrophic. I mean, these are huge. bus-like things, and many of them, and they're monstrosities. Uh, but people know in their heart of hearts that we're dealing with something else. And yet, Israel, I think, and America are pretty much creaming Iran in many regards. I mean, not maybe as much as many had hoped. Iran definitely is resilient in a certain way, despite all of the hardships, we'll say, that it has experienced in the last month, and also during the 12-day war. And they took hard hits through their own proxies trying to destroy us for so long because we punished Hezbollah and Hamas and others who were very much under their auspices. Uh, so obviously Iran felt that as well. So it is quite tough. It is quite tough. Like I said, I'm continuing to try to write, even when you can hear the missiles going off and exploding outside your window. Now, you're in a safe room, so hopefully, not everybody is, but in our case, uh, we have this safe room. You don't always know how safe it really is. It's like you hope for the best, but it is Russian roulette. And the place where I am, it's one of the most heavily hit areas in Israel. So it's very common that we get the alert. We come into the safe room or the mamad. We close the door. We have an iron curtain, I like to call it, which of course that's a whole other discussion, which you basically roll over the window hole and it is like an iron slab, but it's a curtain that goes over the window. And so you're sealed into this room, which is fortified. Also within the walls itself, it's a kind of cage, and hopefully one would hope, would withstand at least some types of disturbance. It doesn't withstand all of them, unfortunately, depending. So you hope for the best, like I said. But unfortunately, sometimes the best for you could be someone else's worst. It could be your neighbor's worst. So that's the thing. I say, I hope for the best for my family, but it could be the end of my neighbor and my neighbor's family. So it's a very difficult thing because, I'm sure that they in their apartments are also hoping for their best. And it doesn't mean that you wish worse on your neighbor. You're supposed to love your neighbor as yourself, right? So, yeah, it's a very tough thing. Like I said, so yeah, we come to the room and then, you have a countdown on the phone and you watch. It's about 90 seconds until impact is supposed to occur. And once you get to zero, it's usually not immediate. It sometimes takes a few more seconds, 30, 10, 20, 30 seconds, up to a minute, minute and a half. Then you hear that cluster separation seemingly in some cases, and then you hear the bomblets and they crash all around you. And, in some cases not around and but, on you. Depends, and it's a very, you hear those explosions. I mean, it's very loud. It shakes where you are. I mean, and sometimes you hear booms in the distance and it really feels it's like muffled, but then other times you can actually hear like concrete buckling. You can hear wood snapping. You can hear rebar popping. Like you hear those intimate sounds, and it's not just like a muffled boot, like, sort of, what's the word, um, generic boom sound, that you put on your soundboard. It's like, these are intimate booms that you can kind of like anatomically dissect. That was the rebar popping. That was the wood splintering. That was the concrete buckling. Never in my life. And now, I mean, that's what I was saying when it first happened, but it's now happened so many times during the last wars that I'm already used to it. I remember how amazed I was by that because on the one hand, obviously it's scary and it's horrifying, but on the other hand, as a writer, as a person who has to experience these things deeply for a living, I'm not just monetarily, but also spiritually. You know, you're trying to like not only deal with the maddening trauma of it, but also how am I going to write this up afterward or during? And that's my constant concerns. That's like the weirdest part, perhaps, of my life that I'm in here with my family, and we're experiencing what I would call a boomdom. How's that for Pandooradom? And not only am I thinking about the safety of my family, not only am I thinking about survival on the deepest primal level, but I'm also thinking, on the other hand, of how am I going to write this? How do I put this experience into words? How do I transmit this in les mots justes? Thank you very much for listening. This has been the latest episode of Pandooradom, 2006, April. Much appreciated. Thank you for joining me. I'm sorry that my co-host sorry, sorry that my co-host Paul Cradle could not make it. And I will see you soon. Before we go, remember, here at Pandooradom is not just Pandora. It is a dumb. It is Pandooradom.